He had Bill Clinton on his plane 26 times. Prince Andrew at his parties. Donald Trump called him a friend. When police finally raided his mansion, they found a safe packed with CDs labeled Young, Name, plus, Named. Inside were hundreds of photos of underage girls. The FBI had everything they needed to put him away for life. Instead, he got a deal so corrupt, a federal judge later ruled it illegal. This is how Jeffrey Epstein trafficked children for decades, bought his freedom once, and why his second arrest terrified the world's most powerful people. Subscribe. You need to see where this goes. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't born into wealth. He grew up in Brooklyn, taught math and physics at a private school in Manhattan, despite having no college degree, then somehow landed on Wall Street. By the 1980s, he was managing money for billionaires. By the 1990s, he had his own fortune, though no one could quite explain how he made it or who his clients really were. But money was never the end game. It was the tool. Between 2002 and 2005, Epstein physically abused dozens of underage girls at his Palm Beach mansion. The system was calculated and ruthless. He employed recruiters, some were his own previous victims, who targeted vulnerable girls. They'd approach them at shopping malls, parks, trailer parks, and schools. The pitch was always the same. Give an old man a massage, make $200 to $300, easy money. The youngest victim identified by police was 14 years old. Once inside his mansion, the girls were led to a room with a massage table. Epstein would be waiting, sometimes inappropriately dressed. What started as massage requests quickly escalated to physical abuse. He'd touch them inappropriately. He'd force them to touch him. He'd use objects on them. And then he'd hand them cash and ask if they knew other girls who needed money. The recruiting was strategic. Epstein and his associates targeted girls from broken homes, girls with financial struggles, girls who wouldn't be believed or who felt they had nowhere to turn. Many victims brought friends, who then brought more friends. Each girl was paid extra for every new recruit. It was a pyramid scheme built on child abuse. Epstein didn't operate alone. His longtime companion, British socialite Ghislaine Maxwell, allegedly helped recruit and groom victims. Household staff scheduled the appointments. Assistants arranged travel. Flight logs would later show young women who appeared underage traveling with Epstein on his private Boeing 727, which became known as the Lolita Express. His Palm Beach mansion had a specific room designed for abuse. Police who later searched the property found photographs of underage girls throughout the house. They found a massage room with inappropriate items. They found evidence of a carefully constructed system designed to normalize and facilitate the abuse of children. And for years, nobody stopped him. If you want to understand how this happened, stay with me and hit subscribe. March 2005. A woman walks into the Palm Beach Police Department with her 14-year-old daughter. The girl tells Detective Joseph Recari that she was brought to Jeffrey Epstein's mansion, told to remove clothing, and paid $300 to massage him while he touched himself inappropriately and groped her. Recari could have written it off as a one-time complaint against a wealthy man. Instead, he investigated. What he uncovered was staggering. Within months, Recari and his team identified over 30 victims. The stories were horrifyingly similar. Young girls, many between 14 and 16 years old, recruited with promises of easy money, then physically abused in Epstein's home. Phone records showed some girls being called to the mansion multiple times per day. Victim after victim came forward once they learned they weren't alone. The evidence was overwhelming. Palm Beach police built a case they believed would put Epstein away for life. They presented their findings to the Palm Beach County State Attorney's Office, recommending charges that could carry decades in prison. But the state attorney punted the case to federal prosecutors, believing it was too big for state court. That decision changed everything. The case landed with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Florida. The U.S. attorney was a man named Alexander Acosta, who would later become President Trump's labor secretary. Acosta was ambitious, politically connected, and facing a defendant who had unlimited resources and some of the most powerful lawyers in America. Epstein hired Alan Dershowitz, the famed Harvard law professor. He hired Kenneth Starr, the former independent counsel, who investigated President Bill Clinton. He hired Roy Black, one of Florida's most successful criminal defense attorneys. This wasn't just a legal team, it was an army. Subscribe so you don't miss what this army accomplished. And then the negotiations began. For months, Epstein's lawyers and federal prosecutors worked on a deal. Victims were kept in the dark. Detective Carey, who had spent a year building the case, watched in frustration as the federal investigation stalled. By 2007, it was clear something unusual was happening. In June 2008, the deal was finalized. If you're finding this as shocking as I did researching it, subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss part 2. Jeffrey Epstein would plead guilty to 2 state prostitution charges in Florida. Not child sex trafficking, not rape, prostitution, charges that falsely implied his victims were willing participants rather than abused children. The sentence, 18 months in county jail with credit for time served. In reality, he'd served 13 months. But it gets worse. The deal included work release 6 days a week, 12 hours a day. Epstein was allowed to leave jail each morning, go to his downtown West Palm Beach office, and return each evening. He had his own private wing of the jail. He hired his own security guards for his office. For most of those 13 months, he wasn't really imprisoned at all. The federal investigation, the one that had identified dozens of victims and could have brought charges carrying life in prison, was shut down completely. Epstein got immunity from all federal charges. And here's the part that made legal history. The deal included immunity for any potential co-conspirators. This unusual clause meant anyone who had helped Epstein traffic or abuse girls also couldn't be prosecuted federally. Why would prosecutors agree to protect people they hadn't even charged yet? The clause suggested Epstein was shielding others, possibly powerful others. Make sure you're subscribed because the names connected to this case will shock you. The victims were never told about the deal until after it was signed, a direct violation of the Crime Victims' Rights Act. They had no chance to object or challenge it in court. Years later, a federal judge would rule that prosecutors broke the law by hiding the agreement from Epstein's victims. In July 2009, Jeffrey Epstein walked out of jail a registered sex offender with a criminal record but otherwise a free man. He went back to his mansions, his island, his private jet, his life. Detective Carey, who had devoted more than a year to the case, told reporters he'd never seen anything like it. The victims felt betrayed by the justice system, and Epstein's lawyers celebrated what was widely considered one of the most favorable plea deals in modern American legal history. Alexander Acosta would later claim he'd been told to back off because Epstein belonged to intelligence, though he never provided evidence for this claim. When the plea deal resurfaced in 2019, the controversy forced Acosta to resign as labor secretary. For 11 years, Epstein lived freely, traveling the world, hosting parties, maintaining his connections to politicians, academics, scientists, and celebrities. But the victims never forgot, and one journalist decided the world shouldn't either. In November 2018, the Miami Herald published Perversion of Justice, a 3-part investigation by reporter Julie K. Brown. She had spent months tracking down Epstein's victims, many of whom had never spoken publicly. She found 80 women who said Epstein had abused them. Dozens were willing to go on record with their names and faces. They described the abuse. They described being silenced by Epstein's lawyers and intimidated by his wealth. They described watching him walk free while they lived with trauma. The series revealed the full scope of the 2008 plea deal and how prosecutors had deliberately hidden it from victims. It exposed the failures of the justice system at every level, and it reignited public outrage. Subscribe if you're following this story. Part 2 gets even darker. Within months, federal prosecutors in New York's Southern District opened a new investigation. Unlike the Florida case, this one wouldn't be negotiated away. On July 6, 2019, Jeffrey Epstein landed at Teterboro Airport in New Jersey. Returning from Paris, FBI agents and NYPD detectives were waiting on the tarmac. Epstein was arrested and charged with trafficking of minors and conspiracy to commit trafficking. The indictment alleged he had exploited and abused dozens of minor girls at his Manhattan townhouse and his Palm Beach mansion between 2002 and 2005. Some victims were as young as 14. Prosecutors described a vast network designed to recruit vulnerable girls, groom them for abuse, and maintain secrecy through intimidation and payoffs. This time, prosecutors made clear there would be no deal. They argued Epstein was an extreme flight risk with nearly unlimited wealth, multiple properties around the world, a private jet, and foreign connections. A judge agreed and ordered him held without bail at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan, a federal detention facility in Lower Manhattan. Epstein's lawyers immediately appealed the bail decision, arguing he should be released to house arrest in his Manhattan mansion. The appeal was pending when events took a turn no one anticipated. Jeffrey Epstein finally faced justice. He sat in a federal jail cell knowing he'd likely die in prison. The evidence against him was overwhelming. His victims were ready to testify. There would be no sweetheart deal this time. But Epstein would never stand trial. What happened next inside the Metropolitan Correctional Center raised questions that remain unanswered today. In Part 2, we'll cover his time in prison, the events of August 10, 2019, the suspicious circumstances surrounding his death, and why so many people believe the official story doesn't add up. This is a story about power, about a broken system, and about victims who fought for years to be heard. And it's not over yet. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Part 2 drops next week, and you won't believe what the evidence shows. In Part 2 of this investigation, we're going inside the cell where Jeffrey Epstein died. The cameras that malfunctioned. The guards who fell asleep. The bones in his neck that a top forensic pathologist said were broken the wrong way. And the will he signed 48 hours before his body was found. What you're about to hear isn't conspiracy theory, it's documented evidence. Even the Attorney General called it a perfect storm of failures. This is what happened in the final weeks of Jeffrey Epstein's life. Jeffrey Epstein wasn't born into wealth. He grew up in Brooklyn, taught math and physics at a private school in Manhattan. Despite having no college degree, he somehow landed on Wall Street. By the 1980s, he was managing money for billionaires. By the 1990s, he had his own fortune, though no one could quite explain how he made it or who his clients really were. The Metropolitan Correctional Center sits in Lower Manhattan, a 12-story concrete fortress that has held mob bosses, terrorists, and drug kingpins. When Epstein arrived on July 8, 2019, he became inmate number 76318-054. He was 66 years old, facing up to 45 years in prison on federal trafficking charges. His lawyers were already working on another bail appeal. Prosecutors had made it clear there would be no deal this time. Inside MCC, Epstein was placed in the Special Housing Unit, a section for high-profile inmates who need protection from the general population. His cell was 10 feet by 8 feet. A metal bed frame bolted to the wall. A steel toilet. A small desk. No privacy, constant surveillance. And checks by guards every 30 minutes. That was the protocol. Within 2 weeks, something happened that should have changed everything. On July 23rd, guards found Epstein unconscious on his cell floor. He had marks on his neck. His face was flushed. Guards revived him and called for medical staff. The incident was immediately flagged as a possible attempt to take his own life. Prison officials launched an investigation. Epstein was placed on watch in a special observation cell where inmates are monitored continuously to prevent self-harm. But there was another story. Epstein's cellmate at the time was Nicholas Tartaglione, a former police officer from New York awaiting trial for 4 murders. Tartaglione told investigators he found Epstein unconscious and called for help. He denied hurting him. Epstein himself reportedly told officials that Tartaglione had attacked him, though this was never confirmed. Tartaglione's lawyer insisted his client had nothing to do with the incident and may have actually saved Epstein's life. 6 days later, on July 29th, Epstein was removed from observation and returned to the Special Housing Unit. A Bureau of Prison psychologist had evaluated him and cleared him to return to a regular cell. This decision would later be questioned by investigators. The protocol for inmates who had just been on observation was clear. They must have a cellmate. Someone to watch them. Someone to alert guards if something goes wrong. Epstein was assigned a cellmate. For days, everything seemed routine. Then on August 9th, something changed. Epstein's cellmate was transferred to another facility. No replacement was assigned. Epstein spent that night alone in his cell, violating the prison's own protocols. That same evening, both guards assigned to Epstein's unit were working overtime. One was on his 5th consecutive day of mandatory overtime. The other wasn't even a regular corrections officer. She was filling in because the facility was chronically understaffed. Their job was straightforward: walk the tier every 30 minutes and visually confirm every inmate was alive and accounted for. They didn't do it. Security footage reviewed later by investigators showed both guards sitting at their desk. They browsed the internet. They shopped online. One of them appeared to be sleeping. For hours, neither guard walked the tier to check on inmates. They were required to sign a log confirming they had completed their rounds. They signed it. They lied. At some point during the night, investigators could never pinpoint exactly when Jeffrey Epstein died in his cell. At 6:30 a.m. on August 10, 2019, guards finally walked the tier for morning count. They found Epstein hanging from the top bunk of his bed. A bedsheet was wrapped around his neck and tied to the bed frame. He was cold. He had been dead for hours. Guards called for medical staff and began CPR. Epstein was transported to a nearby hospital and pronounced dead at 7:36 a.m. News of his death spread instantly. Within hours, the hashtag Epstein didn't kill himself was trending worldwide. Conspiracy theories exploded across social media. People who rarely agreed on anything suddenly shared the same suspicion. Something wasn't right about this death. The New York City chief medical examiner, Dr. Barbara Sampson, performed the autopsy. Her conclusion: Epstein died by hanging, and the manner of death was self-inflicted. But the autopsy revealed details that raised questions. Epstein had multiple fractures in his neck. Specifically, his hyoid bone was broken. The hyoid is a small horseshoe-shaped bone in the neck that supports the tongue. It can break during hanging, but it's more common in older individuals, and less common in suicides by hanging from a low height, like a bed frame. Dr. Michael Baden, one of America's most prominent forensic pathologists, was hired by Epstein's family to observe the autopsy. Baden had worked on high-profile cases for decades, including the investigations into John F. Kennedy's assassination and the O.J. Simpson trial. After reviewing the evidence, Baden publicly disputed the ruling. He pointed to the hyoid fracture and other neck injuries as being more consistent with strangulation than hanging. He noted that in 50 years of examining thousands of deaths, he had rarely seen these specific fractures in hanging cases. Dr. Sampson stood by her findings. She released a statement emphasizing that all evidence supported her conclusion. The medical examiner's office had no reason to suspect homicide, but the damage was done. A prominent expert had raised doubt, and the public ran with it. Attorney General William Barr ordered the FBI and the Department of Justice Inspector General to investigate. Barr himself reviewed security footage and evidence from the scene. In interviews, he said he personally believed Epstein had taken his own life. He called what happened at MCC a perfect storm of screw-ups, not murder, but catastrophic institutional failure. The investigations revealed a cascade of violations. The two guards assigned to Epstein's unit, Tova Noel and Michael Thomas, had falsified records. They admitted they never completed the required 30-minute checks. They sat at their desk for hours, leaving inmates unmonitored. Federal prosecutors charged both guards with conspiracy and filing false records. In 2021, they reached a deal. The charges would be dismissed if they completed community service and cooperated with ongoing investigations. Neither served prison time. The surveillance cameras outside Epstein's cell should have captured everything. They didn't. The footage from the cameras directly outside his cell was unusable. Bureau of Prisons officials said the cameras had malfunctioned. Backup footage from other angles in the unit was preserved, but it didn't show the entrance to Epstein's specific cell. Investigators could confirm that no one entered the special housing unit who wasn't supposed to be there, but they couldn't see what happened outside Epstein's door. Then there was the will. 2 days before his death, on August 8th, Epstein signed a new last will and testament. He placed all his assets, valued at $577 million, into a trust, called the 1953 Trust, named after the year of his birth. The timing was suspicious. The structure of the trust made it significantly harder for victims to claim damages from his estate. Some legal experts suggested Epstein knew what was coming and wanted to protect his wealth. Others saw it as evidence he was planning his death. The aftermath of Epstein's death exposed systemic rot at the Metropolitan Correctional Center. The facility was designed to hold 449 inmates, but regularly housed over 700. Staffing shortages meant guards routinely worked triple shifts. Cameras were outdated and frequently broken. Cells were filthy. The structure itself was deteriorating. Less than 2 years after Epstein's death, MCC was closed entirely. Inmates were transferred, and the building sat empty while officials debated its future. But closing the facility didn't answer the questions. Why were protocols ignored the one night Epstein was alone? Why did multiple cameras fail simultaneously? Why did two guards both fall asleep or ignore their duties at the exact time their most high-profile inmate died? Investigations by the Justice Department Inspector General found no evidence of foul play. They concluded that a combination of understaffing, overworked guards, inadequate training, and broken equipment created the conditions for Epstein's death. They called it a massive failure of the Bureau of Prisons, not a conspiracy. Yet the doubts persisted. Epstein had connections to some of the world's most powerful people. Bill Clinton had flown on his private jet multiple times. Flight logs documented 26 trips, though Clinton's spokesperson said he had no knowledge of Epstein's crimes and hadn't spoken to him in years. Prince Andrew, the Duke of York, was photographed with Epstein and later accused by one of Epstein's victims, Virginia Giuffre, of abusing her. When she was 17, Andrew denied the allegations but eventually settled a civil lawsuit with Giuffre for an undisclosed sum. Donald Trump had socialized with Epstein in the 1990s, though Trump later said he had a falling out with him and banned him from his Mar-a-Lago club. None of these men were ever charged with crimes related to Epstein, but their associations fueled speculation that powerful people had motive to silence him before he could testify. The truth is we'll never know what Epstein might have said in court. His death meant dozens of victims never got to face him. They never got to tell their stories in front of a jury. They never got answers about who else was involved in his operation. Ghislaine Maxwell became the next target. Epstein's longtime associate and alleged recruiter had disappeared after his arrest. For months, no one knew where she was. Then in July 2020, FBI agents found her hiding at a secluded property in New Hampshire. She was arrested and charged with multiple counts related to trafficking and abusing minors. Alongside Epstein, Maxwell's trial began in November 2021. Prosecutors presented testimony from 4 women who said Maxwell had recruited them as teenagers, groomed them, and delivered them to Epstein for abuse. One victim testified that Maxwell had participated in the abuse herself. The defense argued Maxwell was being scapegoated for Epstein's crimes. On December 29, 2021, a jury convicted Maxwell on 5 of 6 counts, including trafficking a minor for purposes of criminal conduct. She was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. The judge called her crimes heinous and predatory. Maxwell maintained her innocence and filed appeals. Her conviction provided some measure of justice, but it also confirmed what victims had been saying for years. Epstein didn't act alone. He had help. He had enablers. And some of those people were never held accountable. In the years since Epstein's death, more details have emerged. Court documents were unsealed, revealing names of people who had visited his properties or flown on his plane. Some were accused of knowing about the abuse. Others insisted they had no idea what was happening. Investigations continued into Epstein's finances, trying to trace where his money came from and where it went. His estate paid over $125 million to a victim compensation fund, providing some financial relief to those he harmed. But the questions about his death remain. Every investigation into what happened at MCC on August 10, 2019, has reached the same conclusion. Epstein took his own life, and a series of institutional failures allowed it to happen. No evidence of murder has ever been found. No conspiracy has ever been proven. Yet the phrase "Epstein didn't kill himself" persists. It's become a meme, a punchline, a shorthand for suspicion of powerful institutions. Whether you believe the official story or not, one thing is undeniable. The system failed. It failed to protect vulnerable girls for decades. It failed to prosecute Epstein properly the first time. And it failed to keep him alive to face justice the second time. Jeffrey Epstein is gone, but the damage he caused lives on in the survivors he left behind, in the institutions he corrupted, and in the unanswered questions that may never be resolved. This is the story of a predator who trafficked children, bought his way out of justice, and died before the world could hear the full truth. Make sure you're subscribed because there's more to this story, and we're not done investigating.